There are few things more tragic than when an investigation becomes a cold case. For most police departments, a case becomes cold when there hasn't been any new, substantial evidence to move the case forward for over 12 months. When a case goes cold, it means that investigators have followed every lead they could find and that they don't have any more leads. For the people working the case, it's incredibly frustrating when a case goes cold. They want nothing more than to help out the victims and their families. A cold case is like having to admit defeat. For the living victims, their families, and the families of deceased victims, the case going cold is devastating. It's hard to maintain hope that justice will be served when there's been no tangible progress on the case for over a year. But a case going cold doesn't always mean that it will never be solved. So here are 10 cold cases that were finally solved. 10. Joseph Mulvaney, the mystery of the skeleton in the box. When Newell Sessions' friend moved away from Thermopolis, Wyoming, he left some stuff with Newell, including an old Army footlocker. The trunk was locked, and Newell left it alone for 6 years before finally opening it to see what was inside. He was surprised to find a human skeleton. Newell contacted his friend, who claimed to have bought the trunk at a yard sale and never opened it himself. Newell called the sheriff, who examined the bones and found a bullet lodged in the skull, evidence that he was looking at the remains of a murder victim. Questions arose: who was the person in the trunk? Who murdered this person, and why? Originally featured on a 1993 Season 5 episode of Unsolved Mysteries, this strange case wasn't solved until 2017. It was at this time that the remains were identified thanks to a woman who believed the skeleton might belong to her deceased grandfather, Joseph Mulvaney. The woman claimed that Mulvaney was murdered by his brother in Iowa and his body was then buried in a trunk. Forensic experts conducted tests, comparing the DNA samples from the skeleton with the DNA samples from the tipster's mother. Their tests resulted in a 99.99% match, proving that the skeleton likely belonged to her murdered family member. 9. The murder of Karen Klaas. The murder of Karen Klaas made national headlines in 1976, mostly because of her famous ex-husband, Righteous Brothers singer Bill Medley. Klaas had been assaulted and strangled on the way home, and she died in the hospital a few days later. The investigators in this case also used the familial DNA testing in order to get a suspect in the case. They ran DNA from the crime scene through multiple law enforcement databases and got a result: a convicted felon. The match indicated that a first-degree relative of the man committed the crime. Through some stellar detective work, they managed to track the DNA to a man named Kenneth Troyer. After the Klaas murder, Troyer had gone on to commit several more assaults, and he was actually in prison. He was shot by police years ago when trying to escape prison. 8. Michael Henley Jr., who is the boy in the photograph. In 1988, 9-year-old Michael Henley Jr. went camping with his father and a family friend in New Mexico. Just 20 minutes after they arrived at the campsite, however, he disappeared. In June of 1989, a woman in Port St. Joe, Florida noticed a white van parked next to her car as she went to the store. When she came back, she found a photograph where the van had been, showing a young woman and a boy, bound with tape over their mouths. The young woman was identified as 19-year-old Tara Calico, and Michael Henley's parents thought the boy might have been him. In June of 1990, however, human remains were found just a few miles from the campsite where Michael had disappeared. Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to the young boy, and medical examiners determined that he likely died of hypothermia. The whereabouts of Tara Calico and the real identity of the boy in the photograph remain unknown to this day. 7. The murder of James Richard Layne. The bloody body of James Richard Layne was discovered in a motel room in Alabama over 30 years ago. At the time, there was very little usable evidence other than a few partial fingerprints on beer cans found in the motel room. With no leads, the case went cold for many years. But in 2004, a dog detective started to put together clues in a way previous investigators hadn't. The notes on the case said that Layne had met with a young man. The detective put this together with the fact that Layne himself hadn't checked into the motel, so he went to the hotel to see who had checked into the room. The address on the check-in card was connected to a man named Samuel Reeves in 2007, but police didn't yet have enough evidence to pursue the lead. When evidence from cold cases started being processed through new systems in 2013, the case broke wide open. The fingerprints on the beer can were run through the system and a match to a recent DUI case popped up. The DUI case involved Samuel Reeves. The police picked him up and Reeves confessed. 6. Two sisters missing since 1985 have been found. Two sisters reported missing in 1985 have been found alive and well in Houston, Texas, and their mother has been charged with snatching them. Authorities in Rhode Island believe that Kelly and Kimberly Yates, now 32 and 35, were kidnapped by their mother, Layne Yates, 69. Yates lost custody of her daughters to her husband, Russell. The couple had become estranged after domestic abuse and cheating allegations. When Layne failed to turn up at a court hearing, Russell was awarded custody. She took her daughters from their Warwick, Rhode Island home on August 26, 1985, and disappeared. Yates, who was living under the alias Leanna Waldberg, is now facing 2 counts of child snatching and up to 20 years in prison under state law. After Russell had been informed that his daughters had been found, he said, "I've always been trying to find my children. And now at least it's up to them to get in touch with me." 5. KROQ murder hoax, confess your crimes. Kevin Ryder and Gene Bean Baxter were 2 morning DJs at a Los Angeles radio station who hosted a morning show called Confess Your Crimes. The idea was to call in and confess the bad things you'd done, like cleaning the toilet with your roommate's toothbrush. In 1990, however, Kevin and Bean got more than they bargained for, a rambling confession of murder. The LA police were inundated with tips. According to the Los Angeles Times, police spent weeks sorting through as many as 400 leads, including calls from the families of missing persons. There was only one problem: the murder wasn't real. An internal investigation by the radio station found that the 2 DJs had faked the call with the help of a colleague from another state as part of a publicity stunt for the morning show. The 2 DJs were ultimately fined $12,170 for the hoax. 4. The abduction and murder of Maria Ridulph. A deathbed confession made by a mother who was tormented by the actions of her son led to the solving of one of America's oldest cold cases. In December 1957, a young girl named Maria Ridulph disappeared. It turned out the police's original suspect had committed the murder, but they'd never been able to tie him to the crime. John Tessier was widely regarded as the town creep. He hung around watching the little girls in the neighborhood play and offering to give them piggyback rides. Before snatching Ridulph, he'd always returned the girls, but unfortunately for Maria, his pattern changed the day he gave her the ride that led to her murder. When his mother lay dying, she confessed to her daughter that she always knew John had committed the crime. This confession led the police to reopen the case and dig into Tessier. Since the murder, he'd been accused of multiple assaults against young women, and in the interrogation he was caught in multiple lies. He had a bench trial and was convicted. This case is the oldest cold case that has ever been solved. 3. Rod Ferrell and Scott Anderson, the case of the vampire cult. By the time the murders of Naomi Ruth Queen and Richard Wendorf was originally covered on a 1997 Season 9 episode of Unsolved Mysteries, the case was already all but solved. Just weeks after the brutal murders, 16-year-olds Rod Ferrell and Scott Anderson were arrested in Louisiana, along with the Wendorf's 15-year-old daughter, Heather, and 2 other members of their vampire clan. The kids met in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town that they called the Vampire Hotel, which one local sheriff referred to as a chilling place. There, they drank one another's blood and engaged in vampire rituals. Police were already investigating the clan before the murders, after Ferrell broke into a nearby dog rescue shelter and attacked more than 50 animals, killing 2 outright and ripping the hind legs off a third that was later put to sleep. Shortly after the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, Ferrell confessed to breaking into the Wendorf home and bludgeoning his victims to pulp with a metal bar. He said that he did it because Heather Wendorf hated her parents and wanted them dead, a claim that she later assiduously denied. Heather was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing in the case, but Ferrell, who had once racked up a $30 late fee for keeping Interview with the Vampire out from the video store for 2 weeks, became the youngest person on death row. His sentence was later commuted to life in prison. 2. The murder of Cyrus Jefferson. In 1986, the body of Cyrus Jefferson was discovered in a field. Stacy Littleton was arrested based on witness reports that he was involved in the murder. Unfortunately, the DA's office didn't think there was enough evidence to bring a case against Littleton. Though detectives were convinced that Littleton had committed the murder, without hard evidence the case went cold. This year, the cold case team out of the sheriff's department started looking at the case again. One detective obsessively reviewed the crime scene photos and it paid off. There was black glove at the scene that had never been tested for DNA. Detectives found the glove and tested it for DNA and it matched the original suspect, Stacy Littleton. They re-interviewed the witnesses, who all remembered their previous testimony, and that combined with the DNA evidence was more than enough to bring a case against Littleton. Over 30 years later the case was finally closed. 1. Monika Rizzo and the chilling case of the backyard bones. On May 5, 1997, 40-year-old Monika Rizzo left her job in San Antonio, Texas with no explanation, leaving behind her purse. She never returned. A week later, her boss called her at home, and she said that she had been sick and would be out for the rest of the week. It wasn't until June 5th that the police received an anonymous phone call claiming that Monika had been murdered and that her bones were in the backyard of her house. The police went to investigate, interviewed Monika's husband, Leonard, but found no sign of Monika at the property. 1 month later, the anonymous tipster called again. Working from this second call, police found a skull and a bag containing human flesh. A team of archaeologists were brought in to excavate the backyard, and what they found was terrifying. The yard was littered with fragments of human bone, most of them less than 3 inches long. DNA testing later revealed that the bone fragments, which authorities believed must have been fed through a wood chipper, belonged to Monika, but Leonard maintained his innocence and authorities lacked sufficient evidence to convict. A couple of years later, Leonard was arrested for attacking his girlfriend at the time and was shot and injured by police following a standoff. His girlfriend said that he had threatened to kill her and chop her up. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Which one of these cold cases was the most intriguing? Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel, so you don't miss out on my future videos. See you in the following video.